It was the bitter morning of December 3rd, 1944, deep in the snow-choked forests of the Ardennes. Private Thomas "Tommy" Callahan lay motionless in a shallow ditch, his uniform torn, his breath freezing in the air before him. Around him, the battlefield was chaos incarnate. Artillery shells screamed overhead, bullets zipped like deadly stingers through the skeletal trees, and men were screaming, falling, vanishing. Tommy's unit had been ambushed by a German patrol 3 times their size, cut off from reinforcements, their radios smashed by enemy fire. By every measure, he should have been dead. Most of his comrades were either killed or missing. The snow was stained red, the air filled with acrid smoke, and the forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Yet Tommy survived. And how he survived against impossible odds would go on to become a story whispered among soldiers, a legend of the war no one could believe. He hadn't been a hero by choice, nor had he been trained for the kind of survival that now faced him. At 21, he was the youngest in his platoon, fresh from basic training, a farm boy from Iowa with steady hands but no battle-hardened instincts. Yet instinct, or something far deeper, kept him alive that day. Every movement he made was calculated, every breath a risk, every second a choice between life and death. At 6:17 a.m., the first wave of Germans had swept through his company's defensive line, and Tommy had been separated, flung into the underbrush by an exploding shell. His rifle lay 20 feet away, partially buried in snow. Blood from his left shoulder had soaked through his jacket, but he ignored the pain, focusing instead on the crunch of boots, the whispers of the enemy searching for survivors. Time seemed to stretch, minutes became hours. His stomach grumbled, but hunger was nothing compared to the need to survive. He remembered what Sergeant Miller had drilled into them back at Fort Riley. Stay calm, assess, and move. Panic kills faster than any enemy. Tommy repeated those words like a mantra, his lips numb, his hands trembling but precise. As the Germans advanced, he noticed a shadow flicker across the snow-covered forest floor. A single soldier glancing over, unaware of the young American lying just out of sight. Tommy realized quickly that the Germans were not methodical, they were confident, expecting no resistance. That confidence became his ally. He waited, timing his movements with the rhythm of artillery, using the noise to mask his crawling through the ice and mud. Hours passed, darkness threatened, yet Tommy's resolve hardened. He scavenged what he could, empty canisters, a half-frozen sandwich from a fallen comrade, a bit of water collected from a frozen stream. Each small victory kept him alive, each careful breath and movement a rebellion against fate itself. And as he hid beneath a fallen log, he heard it, the unmistakable clatter of German boots near the ditch. His heart pounded, but he did something no one expected. He struck back. Using a concealed pistol he had managed to retrieve, he fired 2 well-aimed shots, dropping the soldiers who had been too confident, too careless. By nightfall, he had survived 12 hours in enemy territory, a feat that would later baffle his superiors and the veterans who witnessed it. But the story did not end there. That night, cold and alone, Tommy made a decision that would define his survival. He would move slowly, carefully, over 20 miles of frozen forest to reach friendly lines, a journey no soldier in his condition should have survived. Each step was agony, but retreat was the only option. Each shadow could hide death. Each breath could betray him, yet he pressed on. Night had fallen, and the forest seemed alive with sounds Tommy had never noticed before, the distant howl of wolves, the groan of ice-laden branches swaying under the wind, and the eerie whispers of the enemy patrols still searching the battlefield. Every rustle, every shadow was a threat. Tommy's body ached, his left shoulder throbbed from the bullet wound, and frostbite was beginning to nibble at his fingers and toes. Yet he refused to stop. Stopping meant death. Moving meant hope. He had memorized the terrain from the brief maps he had glanced at before the ambush, but in the darkness those landmarks blurred. His compass had been lost during the explosion. Tommy relied on instinct, memory, and the cold logic of survival. He chose a route through a narrow gully, hoping the steep sides would mask him from any patrolling Germans. His breaths were shallow, every exhale visible in the icy night. The snow underfoot crunched just enough to make him pause at intervals, timing his movements with the distant sounds of artillery and gunfire to mask any noise. Hours dragged. Tommy's mind replayed flashes of the day, the men who had died beside him, the chaos, the unexpected moments when he had narrowly escaped discovery. Each memory was a reminder that survival was not guaranteed. Hunger gnawed at him, but he ignored it, focusing on the rhythm of his steps and the tiny victories of staying unseen. Occasionally, he would hear voices, guttural German commands, and he would flatten himself against the earth, willing his heart not to betray him with its rapid beat. At one point, he stumbled into the remnants of a destroyed supply cache, boxes torn open, food scattered. He found a half-empty can of condensed milk and a small packet of crackers, meager, but enough to keep his strength for another hour. While rummaging, he heard the snap of a branch. Adrenaline surged. Tommy froze, barely breathing. Through the shadows, a figure emerged, another soldier, this one clearly disoriented and alone. They stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. Then the man muttered something in broken English, perhaps a warning, perhaps a plea. Tommy didn't know, but he raised his pistol, the safety off, prepared to fire if needed. The man froze, eyes wide, then silently disappeared into the trees. Tommy exhaled, letting the tension drain from his body for the briefest moment. As dawn approached, the cold intensified. Snow began falling lightly, each flake melting upon contact with his skin. Visibility dropped, but it also worked to his advantage. The white cloak of the forest made it difficult for anyone to distinguish shapes, and Tommy used it to crawl, roll, and shift from cover to cover. He counted steps, used tree trunks and rock formations to mark his path, and avoided any open ground where movement could be spotted. Hunger, exhaustion, and pain were constant companions, but giving in to them would have been fatal. Around 7:00 a.m., he reached a ridge overlooking a small clearing. Through the snow and morning mist, Tommy spotted movement, German soldiers crossing unaware of his presence, their formation loose. One misstep could mean discovery, but he also recognized an opportunity. He picked up a fallen rifle from the underbrush, one of the many abandoned during the ambush, and positioned himself carefully. Though injured, he knew how to aim, how to control his breathing, and how to use the terrain to his advantage. He fired a single shot at a soldier who had wandered slightly ahead of the group, and the sound echoed unnaturally loud in the still air. The figure crumpled, and confusion spread among the remaining men. Tommy used the distraction to slip further down the slope, unseen. The day stretched on, a relentless test of endurance. Tommy avoided paths and roads, often crawling through underbrush, his clothes soaking through with melting snow and sweat. Each encounter with wildlife, each rustle of branches heightened his paranoia. Yet he learned, adapted, survived. He found a small stream and used it to wash his hands and face, conserving energy, keeping his wound from becoming infected. The stream also allowed him to mark his progress. Each bend and branch became a waypoint. By late afternoon, Tommy had moved nearly 10 miles from the initial ambush site. He found temporary refuge in a ruined barn, hidden beneath fallen beams and snow. Exhaustion overtook him, and he allowed himself a brief rest, curling around his rifle and trying to ignore the pain in his shoulder. Sleep came in short bursts, punctuated by nightmares of the battlefield, of comrades dying, of enemy soldiers closing in. He awoke repeatedly, instinct driving him to scan for threats, to prepare for movement. As night fell again, Tommy faced the most dangerous leg of his journey. He had to cross a frozen river, a wide expanse of ice that could not be trusted. One misstep would mean death by drowning, one sound would reveal him to German patrols. He tested the ice with a stick, then crept across inch by inch, heart hammering. Halfway through, a crack echoed beneath his feet. He froze, holding his breath, willing the ice to hold. Slowly, meticulously, he inched forward until he reached the far bank, soaked, numb, and trembling, but alive. By the third night, Tommy was exhausted beyond belief, but he had reached a small village near the Allied lines. Cautiously, he approached, looking for signs of life. He could hear distant voices, laughter, the faint sounds of men preparing for morning patrols. Relief surged, but he remained cautious. One misstep could erase everything. He waited until the village was quiet, then stumbled toward the first building that showed signs of occupation. Inside, he found an American soldier, startled to see a figure emerge from the snow. Tommy collapsed into his arms, muttering fragments of the story, his voice hoarse, his body trembling. Word spread quickly through the unit. Private Thomas Callahan had survived the impossible. Every man who heard his story was astounded. 12 hours in enemy territory, multiple engagements, navigating frozen forests alone, evading capture, surviving wounds, hunger, and exposure. Against all odds, he had done what no one believed possible. The morning sun filtered weakly through frost-covered windows, casting long, cold shadows across the small barracks. Tommy sat on a wooden cot, wrapped in a thin blanket, staring at the floor. The warmth of the room was foreign to his frozen limbs, and the soft murmurs of the soldiers around him felt almost surreal. He had expected the relief and safety of Allied lines to bring him comfort, but the trauma of the past days weighed heavily. Each memory, the explosion, the gunfire, the terrified faces of fallen comrades, pressed against his mind with a weight that no sleep could lift. Medical personnel moved quickly, tending to his wounds. The bullet in his shoulder was shallow but infected, and frostbite had begun to claim the tips of his fingers. Bandages were applied, antiseptic cleansed the cuts, and a medic muttered reassurances that sounded hollow to Tommy's ears. He barely registered the procedures. His mind was replaying the journey, the moments of near death that had defined the last 3 days. Every step, every breath, every calculated risk seemed impossibly vivid now. He realized that survival was as much about mental endurance as physical stamina. The commanding officer entered, his boots echoing across the barracks floor. "Private Callahan," he said, voice a mixture of disbelief and admiration. "Everyone's been talking about you. You survived where many would have fallen." Tommy nodded silently, still trying to absorb the reality of his situation. The officer's gaze was steady, almost searching. "We need a full report, every detail, how you escaped, how you evaded capture, how you stayed alive out there." Tommy's throat tight. He wanted to speak, to recount every moment, but words failed him at first. As he began to speak, the story poured out in a torrent. He told of the initial ambush, the chaos, and the explosion that had scattered his unit. He described crawling through snow-covered forests, avoiding German patrols, and the moments when he had thought death was inevitable. He spoke of finding food, navigating by memory, and the terror of crossing the frozen river. Each detail was met with incredulous silence. His listeners, hardened soldiers themselves, struggled to imagine the ordeal he had endured. Yet the clarity in Tommy's eyes and the precision of his account left no room for doubt. He had survived. After recounting the events, Tommy was given a place to rest. He lay down, finally allowing himself to feel the weight of exhaustion in full. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by flashes of the battlefield, enemy movements, and the constant fear of being discovered. Yet even in dreams, he noticed his own resilience, the small decisions, the split-second choices that had kept him alive. It was not luck alone, it was calculation, courage, and a refusal to surrender to hopelessness. Days passed and Tommy began to recover physically, though the psychological scars remained. Fellow soldiers approached him, some out of curiosity, others out of admiration. Questions were endless. How did you manage the cold? How did you avoid capture? How did you stay sane when all hope seemed lost? Tommy answered each one, but he knew that the full experience could never be communicated. Some things had to be lived to be understood. The enormity of his survival was something that words alone could not capture. Meanwhile, the military recognized his extraordinary feat. Orders came down for a formal commendation. Tommy received the Silver Star for gallantry in action, and the citation detailed his bravery, resourcefulness, and unwavering determination. Yet for Tommy, the recognition was secondary. What mattered most was that he had survived, that he had made it back to share the story, and that he had honored the memory of those who had not. The medal was heavy in his hands, a symbol not only of heroism, but of the narrow line between life and death that he had walked. Letters from home began to arrive, filled with relief, pride, and astonishment. Each envelope carried words that warmed him more than any fire could: family who had feared he was gone, friends who had doubted, neighbors who could scarcely imagine the ordeal. Reading them, Tommy felt a renewed sense of purpose. He realized that his survival was not just a personal victory. It was a story that could inspire, testament to the resilience of the human spirit under unimaginable pressure. Despite the accolades and letters, Tommy struggled with the quiet moments. Nights were hardest. He would awaken in a cold sweat, reliving moments when death had been inches away. The memory of the explosion, the shadows in the trees, and the lonely trek through snow-laden forests haunted him. Yet each morning he forced himself to rise, take another step toward healing. Slowly he began to integrate the experience into his life, recognizing that survival was both a gift and a responsibility. One afternoon, and as he walked through the camp, Tommy encountered a young recruit, pale and trembling after his first combat exercise. The boy's fear mirrored what Tommy had felt during those 3 harrowing days. Tommy knelt beside him, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. "Listen," he said quietly, "fear is natural. It's what you do with it that defines you. You survive by staying calm, thinking ahead, and never giving up, even when it seems impossible." The boy nodded, eyes wide, taking in the weight of the lesson. Tommy realized that sharing his experience, teaching others how to endure, was a form of survival in itself, a way to ensure that the horrors he faced could serve a purpose beyond his own life. As weeks turned into months, Tommy's story spread beyond the camp. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and military newsletters began chronicling the tale of the soldier who no one believed could survive. Each retelling added subtle embellishments, but the core remained. A man faced impossible odds, endured unimaginable suffering, and emerged alive. For Tommy, it was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, resilience, courage, and determination could defy expectation. The recognition was humbling, but it was also validating, proof that survival, no matter how improbable, could inspire hope in others. By the time Tommy returned home after the war, he was no longer just a soldier, he was a symbol. Communities celebrated his return, children listened wide-eyed to his accounts, and veterans nodded with respect. Yet he remained grounded, aware that the line between life and death had never been more fragile. He had survived when countless others had fallen, and that survival came with a quiet, enduring responsibility to remember, to honor, and to teach. In the years that followed, Tommy would reflect on those days often. He never forgot the cold, the fear, or the isolation. But he also never forgot the clarity it brought, the understanding that survival was not random, that courage was cultivated in moments of extreme duress, and that every small choice mattered. He became an advocate for training soldiers in resilience, sharing his story with those preparing for combat, ensuring that the lessons of his survival could save others. Returning home was supposed to feel like relief, but for Tommy, it was layered with unexpected tension. The familiar streets of his hometown seemed smaller, somehow altered by the absence of time and the weight of the horrors he had endured. Children played in the yards he once ran through, unaware of the battles waged far from these quiet streets. Neighbors smiled and waved, but their casual conversations reminded him that life had moved forward while he had been trapped in a struggle against death itself. He was alive, yes, but the world he returned to carried a strange, distant familiarity, as if he had been absent for more than months. Family embraced him with tears and relief, but even in the warmth of their arms, Tommy felt an undercurrent of tension. Their voices, though filled with love, carried unspoken questions. How could he have survived? How could he have endured the impossible? He found himself answering repetitively, recounting events in painstaking detail, yet realizing each retelling simplified the truth. The full experience, the freezing nights, the gnawing hunger, the fear that had sharpened every sense was impossible to compress into words. And yet, he had to try because part of his survival depended on being understood, even if only partially. Friends and acquaintances gathered, eager for the tale of heroism, each person imagining the story through their own lens of imagination. But Tommy quickly realized that the accolades were double-edged. Questions often came with skepticism, eyes widening in disbelief, murmurs exchanged behind his back. Could anyone really survive that? He struggled with a quiet frustration. Survival had been brutal, precise, and lonely, hardly the adventurous tale others imagined. It had been more than heroism. It had been sheer necessity, courage measured in inches, decisions made in fractions of a second, and endurance born of desperation. Tommy sought solace in routine. He visited the local hospital for checkups, tended to lingering injuries, and slowly reintroduced himself to the familiar rhythm of civilian life. Yet the psychological weight persisted. Nightmares returned without warning, sometimes vivid reenactments of ambushes or the biting cold of snow-laden forests. He would awaken gasping, hands trembling, heart pounding, only to find himself surrounded by safety he could not fully feel. Sleep became a battleground of its own, a war waged within the quiet of his bedroom. Seeking help, Tommy connected with other veterans who had faced their own brushes with death. It was a cautious community at first, a shared understanding built on invisible threads of trauma and resilience. Listening to others, he discovered that survival often brought a mix of reverence and alienation, a sense of pride intertwined with an awareness that ordinary life could never fully comprehend the extremes endured. Conversations with fellow survivors brought both comfort and discomfort, revealing that he was not alone in his struggle, yet highlighting the uniqueness of his experience. Months passed and Tommy began to adapt. He started sharing his story publicly, not as a boast, but as a lesson in resilience. Speaking at schools, community centers, and military gatherings, he emphasized the mental and physical strategies that had sustained him: careful observation, calculated risk, patience, and the refusal to succumb to despair. He focused on the human element, the choices that ordinary people could make when confronted with extraordinary circumstances. Each speech was met with awe and silence, sometimes broken by applause, but always followed by reflective contemplation. One day, a young man approached him after a talk. "I've always felt like I'd crack under pressure," he said, voice hesitant. "Hearing your story, it shows it's possible to survive even when everything seems lost." Tommy nodded, recognizing himself in that young man's fear. "You don't survive by ignoring fear," he explained gently. "You survive by using it, by letting it sharpen your senses and guide your decisions. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's what you do when fear is in front of you." That moment crystallized for Tommy the deeper purpose of his survival. His story could equip others to face their own battles, literal or metaphorical, with insight and determination. Despite outward signs of recovery, Tommy's mind occasionally revisited the moments he had left behind in war. He recalled the cries of his fallen comrades, the desolate silence of the snow-covered forests, the blinding explosion that had almost ended everything. Each memory was a stark reminder of fragility, yet also a testament to endurance. He began journaling, not just recounting events, but exploring emotions, fears, and revelations. Writing became a therapy, a structured reflection that allowed him to organize the chaos of memory into something coherent, something that could be shared with others. Recognition continued to follow Tommy, though he often deflected attention. The press labeled him a hero, newspapers chronicled the story of survival against impossible odds, and yet Tommy focused less on fame than on understanding. What fascinated him was not the dramatic headline, but the human capacity to endure. He analyzed his own survival with meticulous care, the decisions that had saved him, the instincts that had guided him, and the resilience that had carried him through near-impossible circumstances. He sought to distill lessons that could benefit not just soldiers, but anyone confronting crises in their own lives. One winter evening, as snow fell gently on his hometown, Tommy sat by the fireplace reflecting on the journey. The war had ended months ago, yet its impact remained vivid, a shadow intertwined with daily life. He understood now that survival was not a singular event, but a series of continuous choices, small and large, that shaped outcomes. Every movement, every decision, every instance of vigilance had been essential. He felt a profound gratitude, not for the danger itself, but for the ability to survive it and continue forward, to turn trauma into teaching and endurance into inspiration. Tommy's story soon attracted attention from writers and historians, eager to document the first-hand account of survival. He worked with them meticulously, ensuring every detail, every nuance of fear and strategy was accurately captured. He did not want myth to overshadow truth. His intent was clarity, so others could learn from the experience. This collaboration resulted in articles, interviews, and eventually a memoir that resonated across generations. The book became a testament not just to heroism in combat, but to the universal struggle of confronting seemingly insurmountable challenges and emerging stronger. Through all this, Tommy remained humble. Public accolades, medals, and media attention were fleeting. The true measure of survival, he realized, lay in how he lived after returning. He focused on community service, supporting veterans, mentoring young soldiers, and advocating for mental health awareness. The experience that had nearly destroyed him became the foundation for a life of impact, teaching resilience, empathy, and the importance of preparation and mental fortitude. Survival, he learned, extended far beyond the battlefield. It was an ongoing process of adaptation, courage, and purpose. As Tommy continued sharing his experiences, he began to notice a profound shift in the way people listened. At first, audiences were captivated by the dramatic story of near-death and survival, hanging on each detail of how he had endured when every expectation said he would not. But over time, something deeper emerged. People began to grasp the lessons embedded in his journey. They realized it wasn't merely a tale of heroism, but a guide to human resilience. Teachers spoke of it in classrooms, leaders cited it in meetings, and everyday citizens drew inspiration from the calm, calculated way he had faced overwhelming odds. The story became a bridge connecting personal courage to universal human experience. Even with this growing recognition, Tommy remained cautious about the way he framed his narrative. He knew the danger of glorifying suffering or simplifying survival into a neat story. The truth was messier, filled with moments of despair, fear, and uncertainty. Every decision, every movement had consequences that could not be undone. He shared these realities openly, describing the emotional turbulence, the isolation, and the mental endurance required just as much as the physical strength. Audiences responded not with shock alone, but with contemplation, understanding that survival was complex, demanding, and fundamentally human. Tommy's journey into public speaking and writing opened unexpected doors. Veterans, organizations invited him to workshops, schools requested seminars on resilience, and international media sought his insights on mental toughness under extreme conditions. He found himself speaking to diverse groups, each with different fears and struggles, yet the core message remained universal. Survival is not about luck. It is about preparation, focus, and the ability to remain composed when the world seems intent on breaking you. The thrill of adrenaline and the horrors of combat had taught him lessons that transcended the battlefield, applicable to anyone facing trials of any kind. Amid this increasing attention, Tommy's personal life also deepened. Friends and family who had watched him return from the brink began to see subtle changes in him, the marks of someone profoundly transformed. He was quieter, more deliberate in his words and actions, and intensely observant of human behavior. Relationships required patience and understanding. Some struggled to reconcile the man they had known with the man who had survived near impossible circumstances. Yet with time, bonds strengthened, built on empathy, respect, and shared acknowledgement of his journey. He found comfort in the simple, ordinary rhythms of life, walking in the park, helping his younger siblings with homework, enjoying quiet meals with family, all reminders that survival extended into everyday existence, not just dramatic moments of crisis. One of the most significant revelations for Tommy came in mentoring young soldiers and cadets. He saw fear mirrored in their eyes, uncertainty in their hands, and the same questioning of capability he had experienced when facing death. Through guidance, he taught practical strategies for mental and physical preparedness, situational awareness, patience, adaptability, and emotional regulation. He emphasized that fear was not a weakness, but a signal to focus, plan, and act decisively. Watching these individuals grow under his mentorship was profoundly rewarding, reinforcing his belief that survival was both a personal and shared responsibility, a series of choices that could be guided and refined through knowledge and experience. Despite outward success, Tommy's private battles were ongoing. There were days when memories of combat returned unbidden, vivid, and unsettling. A particular sound, a certain scent, or the sudden flash of light could trigger recollections of near-death experiences. He learned to acknowledge these moments without letting them dominate, employing techniques such as controlled breathing, meditation, and structured reflection. In time, he discovered a delicate balance, honoring the past, learning from it, yet refusing to let it control his present. It was a continuous process of integration, turning trauma into strength, fear into focus, and memory into teaching. Tommy's story caught the attention of researchers studying resilience and PTSD. They invited him to share insights, participate in studies, and contribute to the understanding of extreme human endurance. Through these collaborations, he realized that his survival was more than an individual achievement. It was part of a broader narrative of human capability. Data collected from his experiences helped inform training programs, mental health strategies, and educational materials, ensuring that lessons from the battlefield could save lives far beyond the war zone. The practical applications of his ordeal brought purpose to his suffering, transforming past trauma into tools for the future. Media attention intensified, and with it came both challenges and opportunities. Interviews, documentaries, and podcasts allowed him to reach wider audiences, but each retelling required careful navigation. He remained committed to authenticity, resisting embellishment or sensationalism. The story's power lay not in drama alone, but in its credibility. The honest action of struggle, fear, and triumph. Tommy understood that trust was fragile, and the impact of his story depended on the audience believing not only in his survival, but in the lessons it carried for their own lives. One particular project resonated deeply, a collaboration with a team producing a documentary on human endurance. Tommy visited historical battlefields, retracing his movements and describing each decision, each risk, and each moment of uncertainty. Filming was grueling, emotionally and physically, but it captured the essence of his experience. The documentary highlighted the cognitive and emotional strategies that enabled him to survive, as well as the broader lessons applicable to anyone confronting extreme challenges. Watching the finished film, Tommy felt a mixture of pride and humility. His story was no longer solely personal. It had become a beacon, guiding others through their own trials. Amid all this, Tommy maintained personal rituals that grounded him. Daily journaling, regular exercise, and community involvement provided structure and stability. He balanced his public presence with private reflection, ensuring that the intense focus on survival stories did not consume his identity. These rituals reinforced the idea that survival was a continuous practice, not a single event. Every day, he nurtured resilience, not through heroics, but through consistency, mindfulness, and conscious engagement with life. Eventually, Tommy recognized that the ultimate measure of survival was not medals, recognition, or even public acclaim. It was the ability to live fully, purposefully, and with empathy. He invested in relationships, mentored others, and contributed to causes that extended the lessons of his experience to society. His story became a blueprint, showing that the human spirit could endure, adapt, and thrive even after facing seemingly insurmountable odds. The soldier who no one believed could survive had become a symbol of hope, courage, and the extraordinary potential within ordinary people when faced with extraordinary circumstances. The final chapter of Tommy's journey begins not on a battlefield, but within the quiet spaces of reflection. After years of public speaking, mentorship, and sharing his story, he faced the profound realization that survival was not merely about enduring physical threats. It was about reconciling the past, finding peace in the present, and creating meaning for the future. Each night, as he lay in the stillness, memories surfaced, both haunting and illuminating. The adrenaline-charged moments of danger, the calculated risks, the weight of responsibility, all seemed to converge into a single truth. Survival was a continuous dialogue between fear and courage, vulnerability and strength. Tommy began to understand that sharing his experiences had become an act of healing, not just for himself, but for others who carried invisible burdens. Letters arrived from strangers describing battles with personal challenges, illness, grief, financial hardship, or psychological struggles. Readers confessed that Tommy's story gave them hope to keep going, to fight in ways that mirrored his own, through strategy, patience, and unwavering determination. He realized that his journey had evolved into something far larger than one soldier's narrative. It was a testament to the human capacity for endurance, a universal blueprint for confronting adversity. Amid this recognition, Tommy also confronted the personal cost of survival. Relationships he had once taken for granted required renewed attention. Friends and family, having witnessed his near-death experiences, sometimes struggled to understand the man who returned, a survivor fundamentally changed. He devoted time to bridging these gaps, learning to articulate his emotions, fears, and needs in ways that could be shared without overwhelming others. The process was gradual but transformative. He discovered that survival extended beyond the battlefield, requiring emotional intelligence, empathy, and the willingness to rebuild connections with care and intention. As he matured in his understanding of resilience, Tommy began to explore new frontiers. He pursued writing, detailing his experiences in a memoir that would reach thousands. Each chapter was meticulously crafted to balance suspense, emotional truth, and practical insight. He reframed moments of terror into lessons of awareness, moments of despair into strategies for focus, and moments of vulnerability into acts of courage. Readers were drawn not merely to the narrative of survival, but to the actionable principles embedded within, the mental fortitude, disciplined preparation, and ethical grounding that allowed him to endure. One pivotal moment in his writing journey came when he revisited the night he had been declared unlikely to survive. He described the raw details, the physical pain, the biting cold, the uncertainty, and the moments when hope seemed to vanish entirely. Yet he emphasized the strategies that carried him through, controlling his breath, focusing on immediate objectives, and tuning out the paralyzing fear of what might happen next. He realized that this granular approach, breaking overwhelming situations into manageable tasks, was key to survival in any context. This insight resonated deeply with readers, many of whom applied it to personal crises, career challenges, or health struggles. Simultaneously, Tommy continued to mentor soldiers and civilians alike, refining his teachings into structured programs. Workshops emphasized mental resilience, situational analysis, decision-making under pressure, and adaptive problem-solving. He stressed the importance of understanding one's limits and leveraging strengths efficiently. Exercises simulated stress, fatigue, and uncertainty, allowing participants to internalize coping mechanisms before facing real-world challenges. The feedback was overwhelming. Participants reported not only improved performance, but also enhanced confidence, emotional regulation, and a sense of empowerment. Tommy recognized that survival could be cultivated, taught, and reinforced through intentional practice. Despite his outward achievements, Tommy remained grounded in humility. He often reminded audiences that survival was never guaranteed, that luck played a role, and that personal effort was only part of the equation. This honesty amplified the credibility of his story. He acknowledged the randomness of life, the unpredictability of danger, and the ethical dilemmas inherent in high-stakes decisions. By confronting these truths, he modeled a realistic perspective that honored the complexity of human existence. It was not about creating myths of invincibility, but offering practical, actionable lessons rooted in lived experience. One day, a former cadet approached Tommy with tears in their eyes, explaining how his mentorship had saved not only their career, but their life. The cadet had faced an accident during training, and the strategies Tommy had taught, calm assessment, structured response, and emotional control, enabled them to act decisively. Witnessing this, Tommy felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. The soldier who once struggled to survive now empowered others to do the same. The cycle of resilience continued. expanding outward, touching lives far beyond the battlefield. In reflecting on his journey, Tommy recognized a profound shift in his understanding of heroism. It was not defined by medals, accolades, or public recognition, but by the quiet persistence to endure, adapt, and positively impact others. True heroism, he realized, was relational. It manifested in mentoring, supporting, and inspiring resilience in those around him. Each survival story he helped shape became a ripple effect, demonstrating that courage and endurance were contagious, capable of transforming communities and societies. As Tommy prepared for one final public engagement, a large seminar with participants from around the world, he contemplated the essence of his message. He wanted every attendee to grasp that survival was not about being fearless. It was about embracing fear, using it as a tool, and acting decisively despite uncertainty. He emphasized that mental strength, preparation, and ethical clarity were just as critical as physical endurance. The seminar became a culmination of decades of experience, a live manifestation of the principles he had distilled from years of near-death encounters, reflection, and teaching. The response was overwhelming. Attendees left inspired, equipped with tangible strategies, and motivated to confront their own challenges. Tommy realized that the soldier no one believed could survive had transformed into a symbol of hope, resilience, and practical courage. His story had traversed from the horrors of the battlefield to the daily lives of ordinary people, proving that survival was not only possible but instructive. Lessons from the extreme could inform ordinary lives, empowering anyone to endure hardship, make wise decisions, and cultivate inner strength. Ultimately, Tommy understood that the true legacy of survival was influence, transforming fear into strategy, trauma into growth, and vulnerability into empowerment. His journey demonstrated that extraordinary circumstances could yield extraordinary lessons, but only if shared and applied consciously. The soldier who defied odds had become a teacher, a mentor, and a beacon. And in that transformation lay the ultimate truth. Survival is not merely about enduring. It is about living fully, purposefully, and with the awareness that every challenge is an opportunity to grow, teach, and inspire. If you thought surviving impossible odds was just a story, think again. Tommy proved that resilience, courage, and strategy can turn even the most hopeless situations around. Now it's your turn. Hit that like button if his journey inspired you. Subscribe so you never miss another unbelievable true story. And share this video with someone who needs a reminder that survival isn't just about luck, it's about mindset. Don't just watch history, learn from it, and let it empower your own life.